All right, so today we're doing the first of two lessons where we're going to look specifically at environmental justice as it relates to Indigenous people. So we're going to first talk about what we mean by Indigenous people, and then we're going to look at the concept of sovereignty, and from there move on to talking about treaty rights for Indigenous people in the United States, and then wrap up by talking about land management arrangements that might exist between Indigenous nations and non-Indigenous people. So I begin with a question that I think is an important question to find the answer out to wherever you are in the United States, which is whose land are you really on? So, who are the original people whose land you're living on right now? And so, all of you may be in a variety of different places this semester if you've got all online classes, so you may need to do a little of that research yourself. But for those of you that are in northwestern Pennsylvania, in the area around Slippery Rock and its surroundings, that area is Erie and Seneca land. So those are the nations that were in that area before white settlers came along. And that region of Pennsylvania, the kind of northwestern segment, was officially ceded to the United States by the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1784, aside from a small area known as the Corn Planter Tract along the upper part of the Allegheny River that was then flooded by the construction of the Kinzua Dam. And so all of the people that had lived there then moved on up to Salamanca, New York, which is where the Seneca Nation currently has its land. And if you look at the date there, that treaty was signed shortly after the Revolutionary War. And one of the things at issue in that war was that the American colonists wanted to be able to take more land away from the indigenous nations. They wanted to expand westward more rapidly and take over more land, and the British government was actually inhibiting that, and that was one of the grievances that they put in the Declaration of Independence, was the British weren't allowing them to take over land and remove and kill the people that had been living there. During the war, many indigenous nations actually sided with the British because the British were giving them a little bit better deal on the whole colonization thing. And so we have this treaty signed in the aftermath of that. And so you can imagine that this was a treaty that, we can raise a lot of questions about just how freely this treaty was entered into when you have the victorious American colonial governments, going out and starting to nail down their claims over this land that the British have now backed out of. So in a lot of cases, and this is especially common in Australia and Canada, hasn't caught on quite as much in the United States, though it's becoming more common. You see people doing what are called land acknowledgements at the beginnings of events and so forth, where they take note of whose land they're on and make reference to the indigenous people of that area. So a land acknowledgement is something that would be said by a non-indigenous person, calling attention to the fact that they are on indigenous land. And then there's also a practice called the welcome to country that would be carried out by the indigenous people of that place. If you get a representative from that indigenous nation to actually say something at the beginning of your event or whatever it is, that'd be a welcome to country. And the basic idea of it, I've got there a kind of super bare bones outline of what these things might sound like. These say we're gathered on the territory of the whatever nation where you are, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and future. And so the idea here is to acknowledge that you're on indigenous land and recognize the specific nation whose land you're on, and to also recognize them as an ongoing living community. So it's not just a historical fact that these people used to live here, but to recognize that they are a living community with an ongoing connection to and claim to that land. So let's talk a bit about what exactly we mean when we say indigenous people. So the text I've got there is the definition that's used by the United Nations. There's a major international treaty, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, that most of the countries of the world have signed on to, though the United States very conspicuously has not. And so the United Nations defines indigenous people, says indigenous peoples are inheritors and practitioners of unique cultures and ways of relating to people and the environment. They've retained social, cultural, economic, and political characteristics that are distinct from those of the dominant societies in which they live. So the basic idea here is that indigenous peoples are culturally and politically distinct from the larger societies, numerically larger societies and more powerful societies within which they live, and that they maintain this continuity of their culture with a time before that larger dominant society showed up. So we have a situation in which there was colonization by some outside group that came in and took over the area, but descendants of those original people have maintained their culture and connection to that land despite the invasion there. So that's the basic framework in which we get the idea of indigenous people. So it's kind of paradigm cases, right? The groups that very clearly fall into this definition of indigenous would be groups like Native Americans or First Nations peoples in North America, the Maori people in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or Aboriginal Australia. So those are cases where very clearly we had certain groups of people living there for a very long time, and then all of a sudden this powerful outside group came in, took over, took the land, brought large numbers of their people over, and became this kind of dominant society on that territory. Then you have other groups where it's a little more complex applying this idea of indigenous to them. I've got two examples there. One would be the Adivasi people in India. So within India, you have groups that are usually living in sort of more remote or rugged kind of areas that are often practicing hunting and gathering or less extensive kinds of agriculture than the people around them. They have their own languages. They don't practice Hinduism, which is be the dominant religion of the areas around them, and so they're often sort of treated under this framework of indigenous, though there's some debate about were they sort of a distinct group of people that was living there before the Hindu people came in, or did they kind of two groups kind of branch apart from common ancestors and so forth. And so there's a lot of debate about exactly how you can apply this indigenous concept to those groups. The other example where it gets more complex would be black people in South Africa, where you have a dominant group coming in, the British and Dutch settlers that took over South Africa, but are numerically a small minority. At I think about 10% of the population of South Africa today is white and 90% black. So this concept applies very clearly to a place like the United States. It gets a little more complex in other sorts of cases in other parts of the world. But we're going to be looking at a lot of examples from the United States where the concept is much more clear in how it applies. So I want to start by giving you a little bit of the terminology that we'll end up using in the United States context. So the first thing to remember is that when you're talking about indigenous people, if you're talking about a specific case, a specific set of people, a specific place, use the name of the specific nation rather than trying to use a general term, name the specific group of people. So if you are talking about something that involves the Cherokee people, say Cherokee. Don't use a more general term like Native American. And in most cases, it's preferred to use what we call an endonym. So that's the name that a group of people use for themselves, rather than an exonym, which is a name given to people by outsiders, even though exonyms are in some cases better known. So, for example, the indigenous people of most of upstate New York, including the Seneca people here in northwestern Pennsylvania, the most well-known term for them is Iroquois, but that's actually a name that came from outside of those nations, and there's a little bit of debate about exactly the etymology of it, but one plausible etymology is that it actually means killer people. So it was a name given to them by their enemies that had a very negative view of them, and so you can see why people might not want to be called that. Right? So instead, we're increasingly people are shifting to using their own name for themselves in their own languages, which would be Haudenosaunee, which means people of the longhouse, referring to the style of houses that they traditionally built. So much nicer name. Right? So using the group's own name for themselves rather than a name that might have a negative connotation that was given to them by other people. But when we are going to try to talk about more general terms, we need kind of umbrella terms. If we're looking at census data, and we've looked at a little bit of census data in some past lessons, the category that the census uses, the label they use is American Indian or Alaska Native. So that's going to cover the indigenous people of Alaska and the lower 48 states. And on the census, if you check that box, they then ask you for the specific nation that you are part of. So you can get that broken down in more detail as long as there's enough people that they'll release those statistics without compromising people's privacy. But American Indian or Alaska Native is the umbrella term that the census uses. And then the Pacific Islander grouping, which again, if you check that, they'll ask you, which specific islands you come from. But the Pacific Islander term would encompass indigenous people from Hawaii as well as from other Pacific Island territories like Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, and so forth. Plus, of course, places like Fiji that are not part of the United States, but people of that descent have moved to the United States. So that's the terminology that you'll see if you're looking at census data. For indigenous people in the lower 48, Native Americans, probably the most widely used term. You'll also hear Indian still used. It's probably most popular among older people. You'll also see activists, a lot of younger people kind of reappropriating that term. So you will hear it in those contexts as well. You'll also see people just saying just native by itself with a capital N, or indigenous. So all those terms will come up. There's also the question of using the term nation versus tribe for a group. And so I've been saying the word nation a lot because tribe can often have a negative connotation, that it can kind of imply some sort of primitiveness, and so some people have tried to move away from the term tribe towards nation, though the word tribe is still often used. You also sometimes see people say tribal nations, referring specifically to indigenous groups. So both of those terms are out there, but there's kind of a push in some quarters for saying nation rather than tribe in most contexts to kind of confer sort of more status or dignity on those groups. Then, as you might have guessed from the way the census term is phrased, Alaska Native, so indigenous people within Alaska, are distinct from Native Americans in the lower 48. So there's cultural differences there that constitute sort of a distinct grouping. So if you're talking about Alaska specifically, you might use the term Alaska Native to encompass their indigenous people. And then if we move to Hawaii, it's important to note that the term Hawaiian specifically means the indigenous people of Hawaii. So Hawaiian means indigenous. If you are not indigenous but you're living in Hawaii, then we would indicate that by calling you a Hawaii resident. So Barack Obama, for example, when he was growing up, he was not Hawaiian, but he was a Hawaii resident, right? Because he's not an indigenous Hawaiian person, but he was living there, so he'd be Hawaii resident. And then Hawaiian means the people that are indigenous. One of our case studies is going to deal with Hawaii, so we want to make sure we keep that terminology clear. Okay, then to very briefly mention the situations in Canada and Australia, two other places that we'll be addressing a little bit in some of our discussion. In Canada, it's a very common term to say First Nations. So most of the Indigenous people of Canada will be encompassed by the term First Nations. So it's kind of parallel to the term Native American that's more common in the United States. But that does not cover all of the Indigenous people of Canada. So the Inuit people who live in the farthest northern part of Canada are considered culturally distinct. So First Nations wouldn't encompass Inuit. They're kind of a separate group there. And then Canada also has the people that are called the Métis, who are people of mixed First Nations and European ancestry who have formed their own distinct communities. So a lot of these people trace back to the early white fur traders and so forth that traveled into Canada and ended up marrying indigenous women, and then they had children of mixed ancestry, and those children, rather than kind of assimilating into one or the other parents' culture, kind of formed their own distinct communities. So now they constitute a third indigenous grouping within Canada alongside the Inuit and the First Nations. In Australia, we usually use the term Aboriginal people to refer to Indigenous people from the mainland of Australia and the island of Tasmania. And there are also some regional terms that you may see if you're looking at discussions of Indigenous environmental justice issues in Australia. So terms that come from Indigenous languages like Koori, Murri, Noongar, and I won't get into right now exactly, which regions and what those cover and so forth. Just kind of making you aware if you are digging into an Australian case study and you run across some of these terms. These are terms in Indigenous languages referring to Indigenous people in Australia. Then there's also the Torres Strait Islanders in Australia. So the Torres Strait separates Australia from the island of New Guinea just to the north, and there's a bunch of small islands in that strait, and the people that live there, the Torres Strait Islanders, are culturally distinct from the Aboriginal people on the mainland. So that term Aboriginal doesn't encompass them. So you'll sometimes see, in an Australian context, people talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. So that whole phrase to encompass all the Indigenous people of all of the territory of the state of Australia. But that's kind of a mouthful, right? Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. That's quite a few syllables there. So people are increasingly just using the term Indigenous with a capital I to encompass all of those people within Australia. Okay, so that's a bunch of just terminology notes as you're reading the readings for this week, or if you are looking at case studies on your own that deal with Indigenous people, just so you're kind of familiar with some of the words that get used to refer to people. So now let's talk about the concept of sovereignty, which is kind of a really critical concept with respect to Indigenous people, and it's why it's kind of at the root of why we want to talk about Indigenous people, distinctly from our previous discussions of environmental racism. That we don't want to just fold Indigenous people into the same discussion of environmental racism as just another racial group that might be subject to environmental injustices, because sovereignty is relevant in the Indigenous context in a way that it doesn't come up with respect to other racial groups that might suffer from environmental injustices. So, sovereignty is essentially the power to govern yourself without outside interference. So, the United States and Canada, for example, recognize each other's sovereignty, which means that if Canada does something that the United States doesn't like, we kind of have to just let them do it. If it's not directly threatening us, we can disagree with what they do as much as we want, but because we recognize their sovereignty, we don't claim the right to go in and make them change or force them to do something differently. And then Canada recognizes the U.S. sovereignty. So the United States does things all the time that Canada's not happy with, but they acknowledge that we're our own country and we can do our own things as long as we're not directly threatening them. Then we kind of have the right to do that. All right, so that's a situation where we have two countries that recognize each other as having sovereignty over their own people and their own territory. So indigenous people formed sovereign political communities prior to colonization. So before 1492, when Europeans started showing up and trying to take over in the Americas, indigenous people had their own sovereign communities, that they governed themselves, that they took care of their own people and land. They had systems of governance, they had laws, they had people in authority to make decisions, and all those kinds of things. However, that sovereignty was denied by Europeans under the doctrine of terra nullius. So, terra nullius is Latin for no man's land. So, the belief among the Europeans who came to the Americas, as well as to places like Australia and Pacific Islands and so forth, was that the people living there did not have sovereignty. They did not acknowledge them as having this right to govern their own affairs because they were viewed as primitive. They were seen as not having all of the things that Europeans thought were necessary to exercise sovereignty. So they didn't have writing systems in many cases. They didn't have a king who had the kind of authority over his people that European kings had. In many areas, they didn't practice agriculture, which Europeans believed was essential to exercising authority over the land. So Europeans, came over and decided that, well, these people don't have sovereignty. Their sovereignty doesn't count, and so we can just take over, right? We can conquer the land. We can drive the people out of it. We can wipe them out if we need to. This land is just free for the taking until a European power plants their flag in it, in which case now suddenly we recognize the sovereignty of that other European power over their colony. So we have this doctrine of terra nullius. But at the same time, the sovereignty was also acknowledged by the practice of signing treaties. So when you sign a treaty with someone, you are in effect acknowledging that they have some kind of sovereignty. And so we have treaties covering much of the territory of the United States and Canada. We have a single treaty, the Treaty of Waitangi, covering New Zealand. It was signed between the British and the Maori people. But Australia is kind of the odd one out here in terms of British settler colonies, that treaties were not signed with the Aboriginal people in Australia. And in fact, a guy named John Batman, the founder of the city of Melbourne, tried to sign a treaty with the local Aboriginal people, and the British government told him to basically tear that thing up because they didn't want that de facto acknowledgement that the Aboriginal people had some kind of sovereignty. They didn't want to kind of make that admission by having a treaty that was there. So they told John Batman, nope, you got to tear up your treaty, and it doesn't count. And so that the lack of treaties in Australia creates somewhat different dynamics in terms of Indigenous politics and Indigenous environmental justice than you'd see in places like the United States and Canada, where there are treaties in place, though those treaties have questions that can be raised about the circumstances under which they were signed and the provisions within them. So in the United States, there were a series of Supreme Court cases early in the existence of the United States that kind of defined the status of indigenous nations under U.S. law. And so the most notable of those is Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831, which coined the term domestic dependent nations to describe indigenous groups. And so the idea here, let me move my video out of the way. The idea here is that nations that are recognized by the federal government have certain sorts of sovereignty. They have certain limited sorts of sovereignty that the federal government will recognize, but they don't have the sort of complete independent sovereignty that the United States might recognize from, Mexico or, some other foreign nation. So there are currently 573 federally recognized tribes. That number sometimes goes up or down. The government can withdraw recognition from tribes or grant it to ones that hadn't had it before. There are groups that are currently petitioning for recognition that see themselves as deserving that kind of recognition, but haven't been acknowledged by the federal government. In a number of states, there are actually state-recognized tribes that don't have federal status, and so their status under state law might differ from their status under federal law. So these tribes that are recognized by the federal government hold partial sovereignty over their members and lands. So they are able to do a lot of things, have a lot of control over what goes on with their people in their territory without interference by the United States, and in particular without interference by state governments. So one of the major things that having this recognized status does is that it exempts tribes from a lot of state law because they're considered a separate nation from that state. And so that's why you can have casinos operated by indigenous nations in states that wouldn't allow anybody else to build a casino of that sort. It's why stores operated by indigenous groups can sell cigarettes without the state cigarette tax being added to it. Because they're not directly governed under that state law because they're a distinct nation, but they don't have that kind of complete sovereignty. So in particular, relationships with countries outside the United States are sort of subsumed by the U.S. government. So other countries wouldn't be engaging in diplomatic relationships directly with indigenous nations. That would all gonna go through the U.S. Federal government. Okay. So it's important then to understand, as we're sort of treating indigenous people as a topic going beyond just what we've talked about with environmental racism before. Part of the reason for that is that being indigenous is about more than just race or ancestry, right? It's about more than just tracing back, your family tree and where did your ancestors come from. It's more than just what do you look like, skin color and all those kinds of things. Being indigenous is also about membership in a community and a political unit. So indigenous nations have sovereignty. They therefore have members, right? You are part of an organization by being indigenous. You're not just a person with certain genes or whatever. And so each nation sets its own membership rules. They make a decision about who gets to be a member of their nation. And they can base that on whatever criteria they want to base that on. So the membership rules for different nations are different. So, for example, some nations will recognize any children of their members as also being members. Other nations, the Haudenosaunee nations, for example, are exclusively matrilineal, that you have to get membership through your mother's side. Other nations are patrilineal. And there are also provisions by which people without direct ancestry might be made members of the nation. And so that's actually become a very controversial area with respect to what are called the freedmen in tribes like the Cherokee and some of the other southeastern or originally southeastern tribes. So at one point in history, a number of those tribes, such as the Cherokee, actually created plantations and got African slaves. So they purchased people from slave traders, and this was at a point when they had quite a bit of political power, and were kind of establishing themselves as major economic and political powers in that part of the country. And those slaves and then their descendants became part of that community. And after they were freed in the end of slavery, they were kind of absorbed into these nations. Hence the name freedmen, right? There are people that had been slaves that are now free. But in recent years, there have been efforts in a number of these nations to actually expel the freedmen, to take away their membership in the tribe. And in the case of the Cherokee, that effort to expel the freedmen was successful, and so that remains a major controversy about whether that was the right thing to do, to kick these people out of membership in the tribe. And so many tribes have, as part of the membership rules, what we call blood quantum. So this is what percentage of your ancestors were native, right? What percentage of your ancestors essentially were in the Americas in 1492? And this is another thing that's very controversial. And a lot of these blood quantum rules go back to basically rules that were imposed on these tribes by the U.S. government. In order to essentially restrict membership, right, to keep them from expanding their membership. And so therefore people with too little of a blood quantum would be essentially forced to assimilate into non-Indigenous society. But a lot of tribes have maintained these blood quantum rules. And so this becomes controversial. It means that certain people that might have a lot of connections with the community might not quite qualify for membership depending on their blood quantum. It can affect people's choices of getting married, or if you marry somebody such that your children wouldn't have enough blood quantum to be part of your nation. That might be a potential issue in that relationship. And then likewise, DNA testing as a way of trying to demonstrate connection to a tribe is also very controversial, because again, being a member of a tribe is about a lot more than just your genetic ancestry. And so the spread of these 23andMe and these kind of DNA testing kits that you can get has created a lot of headaches for a lot of tribes, because people will get their results and will say they have some tiny percentage Native American DNA according to the test that was done, and then these people will show up at the tribal headquarters demanding to be a member of the tribe, and so forth. And so this issue of people wanting to claim membership in a group that they don't really have these other connections to is often discussed under the term pretendians, so pretend Indians. And so a pretendian would be a person who's trying to claim indigenous status for some kind of political clout or economic benefit, for looking cool by being able to claim that you're indigenous, or deflect criticism by saying, well, I'm indigenous and I think blah blah blah, or there can be economic benefits from being a member of a tribe that is economically successful, that has businesses and so forth that are earning a lot of money, and that's shared among the members. So there's certain benefits that you might get from being able to claim membership in an indigenous nation. And so there are people who will try to do that without having any real connections to the community or investment in the responsibilities of being a member of that community. And that was kind of what was at the core of the controversy about Elizabeth Warren. If you were following the Democratic primary last year, because she has at various points in her life claimed to be Cherokee, based on stories that were told in her family, and then she went and got a DNA test done when she launched her campaign to try to deflect criticism, and then the critics argued that she was getting various sorts of social benefits from this false claim to membership because she had no real connection with the Cherokee Nation, right? She wasn't a member of that community. She wasn't, she certainly wasn't an enrolled member of the tribe, but she also wasn't invested in that tribe's politics and culture and so forth. She just seemed to want to claim that ancestry as a way of kind of looking cooler and adding to the diversity statistics of the Harvard Law School where she taught. So that was kind of the what that controversy was really about. And she was a very high-profile example of this issue because of her status as a U.S. senator and presidential candidate. But you have a lot of people doing this on who are less well known. The flip side to that, though, is that Indigenous nations also want to try to be welcoming to people who have been deprived of their roots by all of the dislocations caused by colonialism. You have tribes that are, decimated by disease and warfare, that are forced off their land and pushed westward, or just, pushed onto a very small reservation in very the kind of worst land that the white settlers didn't want. And you have laws being used to try to prevent people from practicing their culture. And all these things can disconnect people from their roots. Efforts to take children away from their parents and raise them in white culture so that they never learn their language, don't learn the religion, they don't learn about the understanding of the land and so forth. And you also have people that were ashamed or embarrassed about their indigenous roots, who tried to hide it. There are lots of stories of people that thought they were Italian, and that was the excuse that their family gave for why they, a little darker skin and so forth, and then come to find out that no, actually they were indigenous. And their, the family was trying to hide that because of discrimination and so forth. So that's kind of the flip side to, you want to avoid these pretendians coming along and getting benefits they don't deserve from falsely claiming membership, but you also don't want to discourage people that have genuine connections that want to rebuild those connections, reconnect with the people of their ancestors, and overcome what they lost due to colonialism. So it's a complicated question, but you can see again this is a lot more than just race in the sense that we might have talked about it in our previous lessons. Another thing to note in terms of membership in indigenous groups is the sort of hanging over a lot of this and sort of complicating the issue of membership in these nations is the Dawes Act passed in 1887. And what that act did was it took native territory and subdivided it into private parcels for each of the members, with the idea being that then people could individually sell that land to non-indigenous people. And the explicit goal of this was to assimilate people into non-indigenous society and ultimately to terminate tribes. That if enough people assimilated and sort of gave up their connections to their indigenous heritage, that then that tribe could essentially be taken off the books and eliminated as a political entity. And that was the explicit policy of the United States for quite a long time, was to try to assimilate as many people as possible and terminate as many tribes as possible, and basically eliminate indigenous people as a distinct social and cultural group. And so having that legacy of these very explicit attempts to eliminate indigenous groups kind of hangs over a lot of the questions of environmental justice with respect to indigenous people. Okay, so I've mentioned earlier that in the United States, many, not all, but many indigenous people signed treaties with the United States government. And so a treaty, again, is signed between two sovereign groups, so it recognizes the sovereignty of the indigenous nation. And so these treaties establish special rights and obligations for these indigenous nations. They give them special legal status that other groups in our society wouldn't have. And so treaties can set aside some land as a reservation that is directly owned by that indigenous nation and is, in theory, off limits for non-indigenous people to come and take away from them. Treaties also could put large amounts of land into trust held by the federal government. So the idea here is that if the assumption was that indigenous communities weren't capable of managing all of their land on their own, that they didn't have the expertise, they didn't have the capital, they didn't just have the pure numbers of people after long periods of dealing with disease and war and so forth. So the federal government took this land into trust with the idea that the federal government would manage this land, that they would profit from this land by selling rights to cut timber or to drill for oil and these kind of things. And then the money that was earned from that would then be put into an account for the tribe whose land it was. So that's the concept of a trust is that somebody else is managing your assets and then giving you the proceeds from that management. So that was the theory behind these trust lands, but they were grossly mismanaged. There's a huge amount of money that was just plain lost. Like auditors that went through the records of the federal government just could not account for what happened to millions upon millions of dollars that was earned from things like logging and drilling and mining on these trust lands. And there was finally a settlement in 2009 because there was a major lawsuit, Cobell v. Salazar, about this. And so the federal government agreed to pay this enormous amount of money to the various nations who'd had their trust land mismanaged. But there's large amounts of trust land that still exists. The federal government still is managing that land on behalf of these indigenous nations that kind of signed it over in these treaties. And then across large amounts of territory beyond the reservation and trust lands, treaties often reserve hunting, fishing, gathering, and ceremonial rights. So the treaty may say, we're signing over this land so that white people can move in and live here, but we reserve the right to still hunt on this land. We reserve the right to still come to our sacred sites on this land and conduct ceremonies of various sorts. So treaties will often set out those additional rights that extend over land that is no longer directly owned by the nation that signed the treaty. So as I've mentioned, these treaties were often signed under duress. There's a very common storyline where a tribe will sign a treaty and the U.S. government will promise this is your reservation in perpetuity, we'll never take that, and like 10 years later there's a new treaty that shrinks that reservation down, takes away more land, and then another decade or two goes by and there's another treaty that shrinks things even more because just the power differential. And we've talked about the importance of thinking about power, right? Who has the power in a relationship, and how does that affect, what the outcome of some sort of interaction is going to be when you have the United States government with the enormous power that it wields, and we have these nations that are, that are really in a tough spot, they often felt like they had no choice but to sign this treaty that was hugely disadvantageous to them, that gave away huge amounts of stuff for almost nothing in return, because the alternative seemed to be to get to lose even more and get kind of wiped out by white settlers coming into this land, by the U.S. Army coming into this land, and so forth. So that hangs over these treaties that they're signed under duress. There's a lot of questions about how legitimate was it for the land to be ceded under the terms of this treaty. But the treaty still doesn't cede everything, right? There are rights that are maintained under these treaties, but even those rights often face very heavy pushback from white neighbors when tribes go to really fully exercise those rights. So there have been quite a few cases in which, for example, the treaty reserves fishing rights over a large area of territory, and for a long time, the members of that nation just didn't have the resources of the people to go out and fully exercise those fishing rights. But at one point they say, you know what, we have the legal right to do this. We're going to go do it. We're going to start fishing as the treaty says that we're allowed to do. And then there's sort of a enormous pushback by non-indigenous people of that area, and protests and blockades and even violence against indigenous people trying to exercise these treaty rights. And the discourse about this often uses this expression, special rights. Why do these people have these special rights? And they do have special rights because they have a treaty. This is a legal document because indigenous nations are distinct communities. They're not just another group of people, right? They're communities that trace back to sovereign nations that existed before the United States was a country. And so in exercising these treaty rights, another, beyond purely the question of, should these rights be exercised at all, another topic that gets brought up is the way in which they're exercised, and a lot of discussion happens around the use of modern technology. Right? So if we have hunting rights, for example, what technology are they using to do that hunting? Because opponents of these treaty rights will often point to the fact that indigenous people are often using, the latest modern technology, rifles with the laser scopes and whatever else, and say, well, that shouldn't count. You should, okay, sure, if you want to go and hunt with a bow and arrow with a stone tip to the arrow or something like your ancestors did way back in the day, sure, but how are you coming out here with this high-powered rifle, or drive into your hunting site on a snowmobile or whatever? And so there's this accusation essentially of inauthenticity, that they're not practicing the thing that the treaty envisioned them doing when it was originally signed. The response to this, from the indigenous point of view, is that the treaty doesn't say what technology you're allowed to use, and there's nothing necessarily inauthentic about using modern technology. The question is the technology you're using consistent with the core meaning of the activity you're engaged in? And so some technologies might not be. Some technologies might fundamentally change the nature of what you're doing, but other technologies might just make it easier or more efficient to do the same type of hunting, same type of fishing or whatever that you would have been doing anyway. And then another issue that will come up with respect to these treaty rights is conflict with non-indigenous environmental laws. So in many cases, there might be, say, a state law or even a federal law that limits the total amount of fishing that's supposed to occur in a certain area, with the idea of protecting species from overfishing. So then that raises a potential conflict if indigenous people want to do a whole bunch of fishing, right? They'd be claiming a large percentage, or even going beyond the limits that might be set by this non-indigenous environmental law. And so that raises that question of, do these treaty rights that say, well, we have the right to fish as much as we want here according to the treaty, does that preempt these other laws that might be have been put into place to try to protect the environment? And so, can state and federal governments, limit these treaties in the interests of environmental protection, or is that up to those tribes to decide, how much are we going to fish in the interests of, environmental protection and the various other goals that we might have? Right? And so then the flip side, the other way to frame that question is, are these other laws, this fishing limit law that might have been passed by a state legislature or Congress, are those laws consistent with the allowing indigenous practices to continue? Are they consistent with allowing indigenous people to maintain the exercise of those treaty rights that they already had before this environmental law was passed? And so, this is especially important when you have not just sort of a direct conflict where, the law says you're not allowed to catch more than X number of this kind of fish, and the indigenous group might want to catch more than that fish, or they might want to catch up to that limit, and so that would leave none for non-indigenous people to catch again. So these really direct conflicts, and you also have indirect conflicts. So if a dam gets built, then that may de facto take away fishing rights because now those fish aren't there to be caught. And so is that a violation? If you've got a treaty that says we have a right to fish in this river, and then, a dam gets built that essentially removes the fish from that river, is that a violation of that treaty? Right? Does the right to fish entail that you won't take those fish away before they can be caught by the people that have that right to them? Okay, so then the last thing that I want to talk a little bit about is then the relationships that might exist between indigenous nations and dominant non-indigenous institutions with respect to managing areas of land. And so we have all this land that has, it's indigenous land, but then there's non-indigenous governments also trying to manage that land. So I'm going to talk about this sort of four different forms that this relationship might take. So the first one is rejection. So dominant institutions may just say that indigenous knowledge and practices just don't count. We're going to ignore them. We're going to essentially give this land entirely into the control of these non-indigenous dominant institutions. The second form that might take is learning. So dominant institutions may try to incorporate indigenous knowledge and practices. They may talk to indigenous people and say, what do you know about this land? What information do you have about the species that are here and how they live and what habitat they're found in, and what kind of practices are good or bad for maintaining these species and so forth. You're seeing that increasingly these days with respect to fire. There's a lot of interest in learning about indigenous fire practices, so you can try to imitate those in the landscape to try to reduce the risks of major fires. So there you're incorporating indigenous knowledge and practices into the management that's still being conducted by these dominant institutions. And this, depending on how you go about doing this learning, there's often a lot of resentment among indigenous people that non-indigenous people keep coming, researchers and stuff keep coming to them and writing down all of their knowledge and then going and publishing it and getting to be famous and building a career on sharing this knowledge that you got from somebody else who isn't getting that same kind of credit. Then we also have the option of co-management. So here you have a partnership formed between these dominant institutions and indigenous people, where they're going to work together to come up with a plan to manage the land, that they're going to try to balance all of the different values and goals that both sides have for what we want to see from this land. And so there's a number of national parks in Australia that have become kind of icons of this co-management. So Kakadu National Park in the very northern part of Australia, and Uluru in the center of Australia. So you've probably seen, even if you don't recognize the name, you've probably seen Uluru. It's that giant red rock that sticks out of the desert there. Both of those parks are under co-management systems, where the Australian government and the local indigenous groups work together to figure out how to manage the land, how to make decisions about things like, the use of fire on that land, about how to handle invasive species that come in, how to regulate visitor numbers and their environmental impact, and all those kinds of things. And then the fourth possible option would be for dominant institutions to recognize the sovereignty of indigenous groups and essentially back off and say, no, this is your land, you get to manage it, right? This is indigenous land, and so these dominant institutions would act only in a support role, if at all, in land management. So land would essentially be fully turned over to the indigenous people for them to manage without this non-indigenous institutions playing a role. That is probably the rarest of these, because powerful institutions don't like giving up that power. But it's something that you'll see a lot of activists pushing for. That's often the goal that people are working towards in these kind of controversies. So I will leave it there, and we will have a second lesson pulling up some more important themes about Indigenous environmental justice next week.